Welcome to our panelists. We have the great honor and privilege to have three of our international guests kicking off the stimulating set of 2 days for us. And we thought it was very important to start by hearing them, because all of us are involved in international cooperation, international development, and this is all about people who are not in this room necessarily, the people we work with, our partners overseas, the people who are involved in the programs and projects that we implement. So having the privilege of having three very well-informed, very diverse, very committed people who work in international development issues or issues of interest to us, but who work from a very strong Southern perspective, hopefully will set the stage for all of our reflections over the next 2 days. So my job is only to introduce our great moderator, Rohinton Medhora. I'm sure many of you in the room know Rohinton and remember him well from his days in Ottawa as the Vice President of IDRC. I know CCIC had a lot of interaction and support from Rohinton when he was occupying that role and was instrumental in cementing our relationship with IDRC. Rohinton has very graciously agreed to be with us today, and we thank him for that. He is, of course, a long-time and engaged development thinker. While he is currently president of the Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI, a nonpartisan think tank located in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. So he has left Ottawa a couple of years ago. That he was telling me this morning that when he goes to buy his coffee in Bridgehead, he runs into 5 or 6 people and he can't buy his coffee. So he is very much at home here in Ottawa, and maybe that's part of the reason why he accepted to spend the day with us. He previously was vice president, as I mentioned, of programs at IDRC, and he received his doctorate in economics in 1988 from the University of Toronto, where he also subsequently taught for a number of years. His fields of expertise are monetary and trade policy, international economic relations, and aid effectiveness. His recent publications include co-edited books on development thought and practice, Canada's relations with Africa, and Canada's role in the international financial system. He serves on the boards of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, the Partnerships for African Social and Governance Research, and the Science and Environment organization START International. Rohinton, merci beaucoup. Puis, à vous.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julia. It's good seeing old friends and meeting new ones. This year, as has always been the case with CCIC, I think you've selected in your new and partnering and privatized format and all the rest of it, but you've selected, as usual, a topic that is live and is going to be with us for some time. And we're in the middle of something changing, so it's not as if we can predict exactly where we will land, which is why I thought that the timing of this conference and the gathering of this panel is so important. Partnerships in a changing global context obviously beg two questions. What do we mean by partnerships, and what do we mean by the changing global context? And we have three eminently qualified speakers to motivate that discussion. They will speak for about 10 minutes each. Then we'll have a very quick conversation while I encourage all of you to take one of the microphones and then continue that discussion with us with the stop at 11 o'clock. My own sense on partnerships and the changing global context is that lots of things have changed, but lots of things have stayed the same, and I think that should come out by the end of the panel. There's no question that there has been tremendous progress in developing countries themselves, and there's no question that many developing countries are now taking the global stage in ways that what we consider to be established powers doing. But at the same time, the needs and the challenges remain. Inequalities remain, although their dimensions might be different. And the players that are asserting themselves might have changed, and the means they use. Who would have heard the phrase hashtag at a CCIC or any conference even a few years ago? And here we are talking about hashtags. We will be speaking, I believe, in the order that's in the program, three speakers with very compelling backgrounds. Kalpona, to my right, is the Executive Director of the Bangladesh Center for Workers' Authority. She began as a garment worker at the age of 12, and by 16 had been fired for union activity. In 2001, she co-founded the Center of the Bangladesh Center for Workers' Solidarity, which, as the biography states, has been through its challenges, as you would expect an organization like this to do. It lost its legal status. She has been instrumental in regaining it and giving it all the credibility and effectiveness that it should have. And so Kalpona understands entirely what the changing global context in her case and what partnerships might mean. Our next speaker is from the Gambia, and he's Falu, and he's a statistician by training. He has worked in the government of the Gambia and headed the National Planning Commission there, among other good things. He was behind the country's second phase poverty reduction strategy and was central in having it come together. He's also worked with NGOs, Action Aid and Save the Children, and has consulted widely for the World Bank on social development issues in countries around the world, and is currently the Deputy Director for Policy at the UN Millennium Campaign, and so is keenly involved at the global level in discussions with the various groups that partner on the question of the kind of global compact we would like to have going ahead. And then last not least is, to my left, is Bianca Suyama, who is the Executive Coordinator of the South-South Cooperation Research and Policy Center, and has also spent 5 years with CARE International in the UK, working on Latin American and African issues. She also worked at City Hall in Sao Paulo, and finally has advanced degrees from the London School of Economics in democratic governance and politics. Over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Very good morning to all of you. And I really appreciate CCIC for inviting me to talk in this important forum. And it seems to me that I'm talking to very different forum audience today that I usually speak. And I hope I can, make you some connection on what we do, what we are facing, what the global partnership, making change and what it's meaning to us. So it is very obvious that global partnership is very important as to make changes in back home where I work. I represent an organization called the Center for Workers' Solidarity, which is a label-educated NGO, and we are working very closely with union in back home as well as international. And as you know, our work is not so easy to do there because we are fighting with a group of people who are not only the factory owner, they are our legislators too. And global partnership really helping us to make change here. Like our center and my co-workers and many other union leaders was facing tremendous harassment and intimidation by the government and the factory owners in back 2010. While I was in prison for a month, and one of my co-workers brutally tortured and killed. So after all these, still we were able to keep running our program and trying to make changes. It is because of the solidarity partnership we have in global West. I will touch basically 4, very important things for, what I consider in this moment, we're in a historical turning point to make changes, and I will touch base those areas. Many of you know there was 2 horrific accidents that happened in Bangladesh. One was a factory fire in back 2012, which has killed over 112 workers. And the other one is Rana Plaza collapse. I know everyone now recognizes Bangladesh as a Rana Plaza collapse, which we consider is a really a homicide happened, which has killed over 1,100 workers, or I should say 1,138 workers in that collapse. And what is the changes we are bringing aftermath of that? It is true that our workers working in the jet truck factories, and there is a lot of unsafe factories still in back home. But with the global partnership, we are trying to make changes. Now, in this moment, we have a groundbreaking document called a Code on Partnership Fire and Building Safety, which has been signed by over 160 fashion brands and retailers who signed and stepped forward to ensure that our workers have safe working place, a safe workplace, which is so important for us. So just to give you a sense what is the ACORD is, ACORD first time is a document has signed between the companies and unions, and that include workers' representation, include workers' voices. And doing the inspection is include workers to give their voice, how they feel, what they feel when they are at workplace, whether they feel safe or how they wanted to see the changes. And later it goes back to the workers when they follow up report, what will be the corrective action plan. It will do all necessary repair and renovations. It ensuring the workers would have a right to refuse dangerous work, which is so much important. And few steps ahead, it's a legally binding document. So the companies who sign this accord and not comply with it, then they will be bring to their native country court. So this is one partnership, and that that we have now, and that was we were able to get it when we had a tremendous international campaign and partnership with the global NGOs and global unions, this part of the world, like in Canada, Europe, and US. So this is one partnership that I can talk about. Second one other innovative partnership that we have now, again, it is for Rana Plaza and Tazreen worker, which is a compensation package. Many of these workers not being paid their compensation yet, and the law we have in the country that really ensures very limited amount, to pay to the workers. Like if one worker dies in the factory, they will just get $1,200 as compensation. So all the partners that we work within the supply chain, we said no, it should be different. So then we all came together, we started putting pressure on these companies to take a responsibility and pay more. So now we are calling all these companies to pay $40 million to Rana Plaza victims. And we created a trust fund with global unions and global NGOs, and ILO also going to do the administration for this fund. And so far, up to now, we have $17 million which we have been secure for these workers. So this is one other area. And other area that the global partnership has helped us to make changes our workers' livelihood. I'm a country where we have 4 million workers working for ready-made garment industry. Over 85% of them are female workers, and they are so young. They started just to learn what is the economic freedom is. But there is few challenges. One of the main is that our workers do not have their voice at workplace, which just means there is a law to organize and organize union and have a collective bargaining right, but workers are not free to exercise that rights. So last few years campaign by the global union, by the global NGOs and local NGO and union, and getting pressure from few other countries, governments like United States or even the Union, our government has opened a window for workers to organize union. So last 1 year, we were able to help 146 factory workers to register their union. So when these workers will get their collective bargaining agreement, that will help to improve their livelihood. So this is one area that I wanted to target. And last one, not the least, that we are in an era now we are talking about that these jobs are so important for us because this is only one industry which has created this much job for these young workers, young female workers. No doubt that we need these jobs, but we are in a moment to say that we want these jobs with dignity. And that dignity, any partnership can help us to have that dignity. And what we consider the dignities are, we consider the dignity can come with three things. One, a decent wages. Second, a safe workplace. And third one, a union voice at workplace. So the Global West Partnership can help to get this dignity at our workplace. So I end up with these, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to CCIC and everybody that has managed to get me here this year. I know I was supposed to be part of you last year. I had some issues towards the end and couldn't be here, and it almost happened again tomorrow and yesterday. But luckily, I was able to go through those issues. I have quite a very challenging task. I think the Chair is giving me just 10 minutes. And I'd love to have 1 hour. Unfortunately, I don't, but I'll try to go through what I want to go through with you as quickly as possible. And then hopefully during the discussions and during the next 3 days, we should be able to talk more about some of these things. I want to go back to what the Chair said at the beginning in terms of what is the meaning of partnerships. And from where I am coming from a developmental context, we've seen partnership as mainly, particularly between the North and the South, as giving money to finance development. Generally, when we talk of partnerships, that's what people are talking about. But it's not just that. I believe partnerships should be looked at in a much more broader sense in the developmental context in terms of how we work together to achieve human well-being or human welfare. Again, I stress that partnership is about achieving human welfare. Sitting at the UN, the other time I was confronted by an animal rights group to say we need to include animal rights in the new agenda. And I said, well, I'm not sure to what extent we really can start addressing animal rights or animal issues at the moment. I think development for now is focused on human beings. Well, that is subjected to discussion. Some may have a different view. The other issue I want to say about partnerships is that traditionally the world has been divided into North-South and developed and developing countries. And I think this is changing. Of course, North-South remains and will remain. Canada will always remain in the North physically. South Africa will always remain in the South physically. But then that the North is developed and the South is underdeveloped, that's the philosophy that's changing, and we need to recognize that. Now, I'm going to do my presentation in two major parts. One is I want to look at partnerships globally from the context of the UN and the overall global context. And then specifically, if I have time, I want to talk about Africa, as well. Now, from the UN and global context, there are three things here that I want to talk about. First is the issue of global partnership for development. Now, as we know, this what is sort of like termed the global partnership for development was this whole movement on the issue of aid effectiveness. We started in Paris. We had the Paris Declaration. Later on, moved on to Akter in 2008 with the Akter Agenda for Action. Later on, moving on to Busan, the Busan Plan of Action, and then recently in Mexico. This partnership actually is just focused on aid. It looks at aid effectiveness, and again, based on the paradigm of the developed countries providing aid or providing money to developing countries to finance development. And I believe this is something that needs to change. We know developed countries are no longer in a position to provide the amount of money they used to provide. They have their own issues. And also developed countries, we think that we really need to look at how we could be supported to actually do effective domestic resource mobilization to finance our own development. In other words, move away from being spoon-fed to supporting us to finance our own development. Now, the other kind of partnership was with the MDGs. When the MDGs were formulated in 2008, there were 8 of them. 7 MDGs were focused on development, MDG 1 on the poverty, nutrition, employment, etc. MDG 2 on education, MDG 3 on gender, MDGs 4, 5, 6 on health, infant mortality, maternal mortality, and the communicable diseases, and MDG 7 on environmental sanitation. Now, the 8th MDG was what was called Partnership for Development, Global Partnership. And that was meant for, again, based on the paradigm, financing the MDG agenda through the traditional means of aid, debt, and trade. I will talk about 2 of those, which is aid and debt. With the debt, of course, working with the World Bank and other Bretton Woods institutions, there was what was called the MDRI, Multilateral Debt Relief Initiatives in a number of countries. Then I was working with planning ministry back at home. Some African countries, Asian countries benefited from the debt relief. And that relief meant that if you owe, for instance, Canada 50 million, you still get the 50 million, but you don't pay it back to Canada, you use it to finance your own development. This worked somehow, and in countries like Nigeria, which is quite big, which had quite a huge debt with the Paris Club, they were able to invest $1 billion on MDGs over a period of about 10 years, and it is really making an impact. The second aspect was aid. And as we know, the agreement there, or the target was that developed countries need to provide 0.7% of GNI to finance development. Until today, sitting here, not more than 2 or 3 countries have actually achieved that target. And these countries are mainly Norway, Finland, the Nordic countries, whose economies are very small. So 0.7% of their GNI is quite small compared to Canada or the US. Actually, the US backed out and said there were no signatories to it. I mean, there isn't much that one could do. But even despite that, when you look at the figures, the amount of aid provided by the US is sort of like almost half of what the rest of the world has provided. Of course, the issue is, what do they provide it for? What is the definition of aid? Is it military aid, or whatever? So that's another discussion of itself. But here the problem was, in 2008, with the onset of the economic and financial crisis, the developed countries had a very good reason for failing to do what they were supposed to do. Everybody said, we can no longer afford it. We have our own issues to deal with. We have employment, housing, and other things to deal with. Therefore, we are not able to provide or meet our commitment. But this was not true. One of my first assignments when I joined the UN in 2008 was to do an analysis of the impact of the economic and financial crisis on development. And what did I find out? The estimated amount needed for MDG financing was about $300 million annually, which they were failing to provide. But within 8 months of the onset of the economic and financial crisis, developed countries mobilized $14 billion to bail out the banks and other financial institutions. So therefore, not providing money for development is not an issue of the money being there. It was political willingness to do so. Because we did a calculation and looked at development financing from 1950 or 1960, when a lot of African countries became independent, to 2013. And we saw that the amount of money mobilized to address the economic and financial crisis was 50 times the amount of money used to finance development over a 50-year period. So it's not an issue of availability of resources, it is political willingness. And I think that was a wake-up call to the developing countries, or developing countries, particularly in Africa, that look, you cannot base your development, or you cannot hope to develop through aid. You've got to find other ways of doing your development. So let me just get mine. So therefore, this was one of the issues with the financing of the NBGs. And then, of course, unfortunately, a lot of our African colleagues are using that as an excuse to say that we cannot make the NBGs because we did not get the money to do the money required to finance development. And then, of course, there are other forms of partnerships within the UN, what is called the public-private partnerships. And we know the SDA has a number of initiatives, such as the Every Woman, Every Child, for which Canada is one of the major funders. That is something which is happening, and I'm going quite well together with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But I don't have time to go into that. Now, the final 2 minutes. The final thing on the post-2015 agenda. When we started, or at the onset of the discussion on the post-2015 agenda, the Secretary General came up with a call to ensure that all stakeholders are part of this process. So he called for an inclusive, participatory, and transparent process to formulate the new agenda unlike the MDGs. Now, this therefore brought into context a new form of partnership, which is partnership with the ordinary citizen. I think when we talk about partnerships, we basically are looking at institutions. But institutions are made of people, countries are made of people, and we, the citizens, we have a role to play in development, and we need to be considered as equal and critical partners in this process. Also, as you know, there was the high-level panel that was formed by the SJ, and they called for a redefinition of partnerships for development, and brought in new or existing partners, for instance, local and regional governments. We know every development program that we have, from a global commitment to a national program, it has to be implemented within a jurisdiction administered by a local authority. And normally they are not considered as critical partners, particularly in implementation. But then, of course, we understand within the UN, it is a little bit sensitive talking about regional and local governments, because the member states will tell you, they don't have a place here. This is a seat for national government. So that has created some slight problems, but we know that the issue of local and regional governments are critical in development. They are a critical partner. The other one that they looked at was parliamentarians. Of course, they are part of the national setup, but then overall, as a group of people who have 4 critical roles, they represent the people where we have representational parliaments, they legislate, they appropriate, and they oversight. Now, with these 4 critical roles that they have to play, parliamentarians also need to come in within the context of the new partnership. And then finally, there was a call for a greater role of the private sector, not only through CSR, or corporate social responsibility, but the private sector taking its rightful place in helping to finance development. Of course, in an ethical manner. But then again, this is an issue that civil society is very skeptical of. The other time I was in a session where they say the UN is privatizing development, and see the partnership between the UN and private sector as actually handing over the fate of citizens to the private sector, which I think is unfortunate. I mean, private sector have a role to play, and the UN needs to ensure that they engage with the private sector in an ethical manner, and not just any private sector entity that goes that comes to play. Okay, then I wanted to talk about the particular issues of Africa. Unfortunately, I mean, I don't have time, but hopefully we will have time, and I think there's a special session on Friday to talk about Africa. But all I want to say is that in Africa, I think we've realized, as I said, this wake-up call that aid would not develop Africa. So now we're coming up with what we call economic transformation program, a partnership that transforms economies, that will help facilitate the mobilization of domestic resources to finance development. And there are two basic documents we've been working on in the past 2 years. One is what is called an Africa Vision 2063. It's a 50-year vision looking at where we will promote economic.
Sorry, as you correctly said, there will be an opportunity.
Yeah. And the other one would be the Africa Common Position. So unfortunately, this is what I have time for, and I hope we will have more time to share during the discussions. Thank you.
Hi, good morning to everyone. I would first obviously like to thank CCIC for inviting me for this exciting conference, and I look forward for the debates today and tomorrow. We as a sector have been discussing how to establish and develop more equal and effective partnership for some time now. And I think partnership became one of these buzzwords that, because of misuse and overuse, is often discredited or turned useless into what we are trying to do. So the challenge we face today, and I think the challenge that this conference speaks to, is how we can draw upon the positive experiences we have in partnerships and take the opportunities of this changing global environment to really not only redefine partnerships, but to rethink and reinvent development. And in this sense, I see international development cooperation not only as a field of action, but as a dynamic space for political debate in which we define the boundaries of what is considered possible and legitimate. I know I only have 10 minutes, and my tendency is to speak really fast and really loud, so I apologize in advance. But I would like to take this opportunity to briefly reflect on one aspect of this changing environment, which is the emerging powers, and particularly the BRICS and their impact on international development. And then share with you an inspiring project, South-South Cooperation project, that I came across in the last couple of years. So the growing importance of emerging countries in international development has become a source of interest and heated debate among academics and practitioners. These actors, and I'm not using the word new donors because they're neither new or see themselves as donors, so these protagonists are guided by principles of horizontal partnerships, non-conditionality, mutual benefit, and demand-drivenness, or being demand-driven. These principles and the actual practice of South-South cooperation is said to be different from those of traditional northern donors. And yet, we know that this country's expanding role in international cooperation is also a reflection of and a tool for their own political and strategic interests. For recipient or partner countries, I think there are at least two reasons why these actors are more legitimate or appeal more to them than northern donors. Firstly, they come with new funds that are not attached to conditionalities. But also, there's a wide recognition that the political and development trajectories and their differences, experiences, can have something to tell for countries, are useful for governments and society in several countries. I'd like to share very provocative thoughts of Paulo Esteves, which is a Brazilian academic, that says that what we have in international development cooperation today is an anomy, and I'm not sure that's the right translation to English, but anyway, what it means that there's a variety of situations that lead to a lack of or a degradation of the norms that structure and guide. Is that better? That's it. So I wasn't speaking loud enough, so I can just do more of that. So what we have is a lack of norms or a degradation of the norms that are structuring and guiding the system. And he says that this is a result of a tension-pressure syndrome. On the tension side is the emerging powers particularly, and the fact that they're challenging mainstream development paradigms and also the multilateral institutions that embody them. But also, on the other side, there are changing environment and incentives and priorities of traditional donors that are causing the system, like this pressure within the system to blow itself up in a way. These tension pressure syndrome is a concept used in Brazilian literature to explain the fall of the military dictatorship. And although this comparison may be harsh, may seem harsh for some, I think what it does emphasize is that the development cooperation system can no longer be defined by a selected few. And I think it says a little bit about what Falu was saying of this changing environment. And there's Rosalind Idle from IDS did an ethnography in Busan, and she called the emerging and the submerging powers. And the submerging powers were countries like the UK. So we keep having this joke. I'm part of a research program that they keep saying, well, but you're the emerging power. You now should be paying us, the submerging powers, to engage in these activities. And we don't agree to that, just in case you come in for funding. Lee Chia-Yong and Richard Carey wrote a paper that argues that the future international development framework will be based on a polycentric geopolitics and on multiple development experiences, involving both systemic challenge and convergence, and will differ from previous dominant structures, both intellectually and practically. And although we may not agree and be aligned with all these experiences, I think what it does bring is a diversity to the system that we all are so much in need for, new ideas, new perspectives, new voices. And I also like the idea of a polycentric system rather than talking about multipolar one, because it brings the idea that we're talking not only about government, but of other actors. And also the idea that we can mobilize and we can partner with others to really bring coalitions for change. And in a way, that's what civil society has been doing for such a long time. So these different government-led spaces, such as the BRICS, but also the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation and civil society-led ones, create valuable opportunities for us to reflect on development model and cooperation approaches more compatible with social justice and environmental sustainability. And I think one of the roles of civil society within this concept is to, in this context, is to constantly qualify the debate and try to mediate new consensus and ensuring the interests and perspectives of the most excluded and marginalized really influence the policies and practices of cooperation. And obviously we can only do that by partnering with others. The project I would like to share, and I'm sharing that because I don't know about you, but I go into sort of regular existential crisis if, you know, we are going to find a way to improve the system and if I should be working in international development. But then every time I reach this point that I'm like, okay, I'm not doing this anymore, I really come across something that is so inspiring that really puts me back into the track and think, okay, this is what we should be supporting, this is what we should be doing. So it's a native seed bank project, and it's the first South-South cooperation, Brazilian South-South cooperation project that was developed and implemented by social movements in Brazil, South Africa, and Mozambique. And its objective is to contribute to economic and organizational strengthening of family farming, and it's guided by the concept of food sovereignty and agroecology. And basically what it does is promote knowledge exchange between farmers, technicians, and rural leaders to rescue, use, and multiply native seeds, and establish native seed banks and native fairs. The movements involved are the Women's Peasant Movement in Brazil, UNAC, the Union for Farmers in South Africa, and a network of organizations in South Africa called TCOE, as well as IBASI and NGO in Brazil. And these social movements and NGO had a very long history of engagement before the project was even developed. And I've been working with them to systematize their learnings. And they all emphasize that this slowly building of trust, and also the fact that they had similar ideological backgrounds, were essential to kind of setting a solid foundation for horizontal cooperation. So they took time to build mutual understanding, and they really, really developed the project focus collectively. Methodologically, the project uses intercultural dialogue and popular education as a basis for what they're doing. And the result of that is that there's mutual respect for the diversity of knowledge and wisdom that they have in these different contexts, and also of the different partners involved. And I kept asking them, you know, how hard was adaptation and what was the obstacles they faced, because this is kind of what we are interested in knowing. And they kept saying to me that that was never an issue, because what they did was really to build upon the knowledge of the farmers. And I know we talk about this all the time in development, but you know, how many times do we actually see it? I think it's a different issue. So they built on the traditional knowledge of those farmers and really tried to see how we could dialogue with other, not only the knowledge of the Brazilian movement, but also kind of more technical knowledge around agriculture. And what they kept saying is that the key difference of the project was the fact that it was led by people with first-hand experience, so true peers, but also that they had something to gain and learn from this cooperation. So they were not handing in something, they were not providing technical cooperation, but it was really kind of a bi-directional relationship. The trajectory and experience of the Brazilian social movement really inspired these African partners and had ripple effects that were not predicted in the project. It not only increased the autonomy of these organizations and social movements, but also this strengthened relationships led to them building stronger coalitions on what they see as their common global struggle against the agribusiness development model. And they kept using words, and they're not involved in aid effectiveness discussions, but they kept using words that we use in aid effectiveness discussion all the time, a lot of times, but with a completely different take on it. Moema Miranda is the director of IBASE, the Brazilian NGO involved in this project, and she said that there's respect for history and accumulated knowledge, and that partners can reflect on their experience shared and adapt to what interests them. She says there's freedom of ownership by inspiration and not imposition. And some of what we hear a lot when we talk about partners of what is the value of Brazilian South-South cooperation, government-to-government cooperation, we also hear this word inspiration a lot. So I think obviously this is one project and the lessons might not be replicable or usable in different contexts, but definitely I think it gives us food for thought in terms of how to move from rhetoric into practice. And I look forward for the debates. Thank you.
So thank you all three for your presentations and for giving us all so much food for thought as we move to the next section of our conversation. So I'm going to invite those of you that have questions in English or French, I should say, to make your way to one of the two microphones which you see in the middle of the room here. And while you do so, let me ask each of you this question, which is that it's been apparent to me for some time, and listening to Julia at the outset and the three of you, when you were at the stage of telling stories, and I mean telling stories in a good way, each of you had very compelling stories to tell on how development can work and how partnerships can work. It seems all very attractive. And yet, as we also know from the very astute point that Sarah made about when choices have to be made at the policy level, development does not sort of float up to the top. So I'd like to ask each of you your thoughts on what it is that we and others should be doing, or what you all have done specifically, because each of you is a success story in what you're doing, to convince people that buying into your endeavor is a good thing. Kalpona, I recall that worker safety and all of that was a big issue in this country, and consumers actively saying, maybe I should be willing to pay more for a cheap t-shirt and make it less cheap, if only, and that's kind of died away, and yet you're living it every day. How do you sustain that? I'm asking you how it is that you sustain the good work of your organization when memories, especially once you move away from your country, are short in these types of matters.
So how we sustain, what's a good question? Okay. the challenges, I would say that if I can, connect with you with those human faces there in back home, that who are with so many challenges in those workplaces, in their community, when they're in the workplace, they're facing a lot of, a lot of harassment and retaliation. When they're at the workplace, they're facing verbal abuses by this factory management. But in other hand, they knows that there is a law. To know that there is a law, there is a protection that can protect them. Is that okay now? Okay. Okay. So that can protect now. So they every day they comes with a hope that they can make changes. Something can make changes, and what they feel that if they can raise their voice, that can make changes. And how we sustain, or how I sustain, I can just add one other thing, that I started work as in a 12 years old, and I went to the factory with my brother who was 10 years old. Went through all these sweatshop workplace, worked over 450 hours work per month and making just $6. So, that just pinching me every day, that I don't want it to see anyone goes in the same way that I've been through. So I really wanted to see that changes. So this is one of the, I think workers' hope is one of the sustainability that we have to move forward. This is one thing I wanted to.
So you've been in the middle of both government and international processes on these issues, and you astutely noted that, we find money for crises when we have to. What's your advice?
I'm not sure if I have advice, but I want to say that I believe one of the problems that developed country governments face is, especially now, is with the electorate, with people like you. You say we'll keep giving money to Africa. What's the outcome? And of course, therefore, they will be happy to come up and say, well, Canadian dollars has helped prevent 500,000 deaths in Africa. So getting those tangible, easy results you expect from politicians is a problem in international development. And I think that's an issue that we really need to look at. Development is not something that you put in today and get out tomorrow. Or as I say, well, with my friend Jeffrey Sachs, development is not a pie where you put in money on one end and on the other end comes development. No, there are so many processes that go through it, and I think we've got to be patient, we've got to understand that we're dealing with human beings, and therefore it is a very complex process that we need to go through, and therefore results cannot be that immediate in the very near future.
Paul Sampson, don't worry, I'm not going to put you on this one. Well, Bianca, the project you described in Mozambique is really, in some senses, I suspect, the next wave of global cooperation. Brazil, South Africa, agriculture, food, technology, Mozambique. In your country, where perhaps the discussion on climate is different than here in Canada, how much support is there for this kind of endeavor? And do you see it growing, or do you see it at some point tailing off the way it has in the north?
I think it's complicated. I mean, in terms of support for South-South cooperation as a whole, what we see with the change of governments from Lula to Dilma is a decrease of support and decrease of funding and a closer alignment, as we see in other countries, of international cooperation and sort of foreign policy interests, including trade. So that puts a question mark there. The second question mark is particularly to this project. There are, one of the big areas of Brazilian South-South cooperation is agriculture. And one of the debates that we have in Brazil is that we're actually exporting two contradictory agricultural models, and therefore also exporting our internal conflicts. So this project is a tiny, tiny, tiny project that is based on sort of family farming and really bringing the knowledge of these social movements. But at the same time, you have massive projects in partnership with the private sector that are really trying to push, monoculture, agribusiness, agricultural model. So how we can sustain it, and I think, as a civil society representative, I think the only way we know or what we hope that we can sustain it is by mobilizing, right? It's by getting people, it's by getting the word across and seeing if we can maintain the support, or in the case of Brazil, it's not even maintain the support, it's increase the support, it's to build a constituency for this type of work.
Thank you. Let's go here, then go to you, and then come back.
My name is Rita Morbia, and I live in Paris. I want to thank all the speakers for their remarks. I loved it, Bianca, when you spoke about inspiration. It's a word we don't hear a lot of in these contexts. I wondered if any of you were at the debate yesterday with the representatives of political parties and what your reflections were.
If it's okay with all of you, can we take two or three questions at a time, and then that way you can address broader issues? Yes.
Bonjour, je vais m'exprimer en français. Denise Gagnon, la Fédération des travailleurs et travailleuses du Québec, affiliée au Congrès du travail du Canada. Je voulais souligner la pertinence de ce panel ce matin, qui regroupe à la fois des exemples, comme dans le cas du Bangladesh, de Kalpona, qui vit des problèmes de pauvreté structurelle, et aussi des exemples de développement, comme l'a souligné Bianca, de développement collaboratif par les pairs. Ça me semble tellement pertinent, et ma question s'adresserait peut-être aux collègues des Nations Unies sur le développement. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de... Parce que les experts suivent un peu ce débat-là. Les experts disent qu'il faut changer l'agenda post-2015 pour s'attaquer véritablement à la pauvreté structurelle. C'est une chose d'intervenir pour aider dans les cas de catastrophes comme au Bangladesh, c'est-à-dire en aval, mais comment mieux travailler en amont. Et il me semble que pour ça, ça nécessite des alliances dans l'ensemble de la société civile, et notamment au niveau des droits, avec les organisations syndicales qui, aussi au Canada, ont vu leur budget complètement coupé face à la coopération internationale. Merci.
Thank you very much to all three of you for your remarks. Lots of food for thought for sure. I want to ask you please to address your advice to this crowd. So from the different comments and remarks that you've made this morning, you've hinted, but I'd invite you to be more explicit. What do you think we in this room, so civil society groups, development practitioners, some government representatives, what can we do as Canadians to support domestic resource mobilization in Africa, to support the solidarity that what do we do with that solidarity? So we feel the solidarity. What actions could we take that would be beneficial for you on the ground? And to Bianca, my question would be around this, you've alluded to it in your last remark, but around this mutual interest, this principle of South-South collaboration, how do you see that being different from the mutual interest that we often put forward here in Canada and other donor countries, which might not be one of our principles, but it is definitely our practice? Do you see that it's a different mutual interest? Do we have something to learn from the way emerging powers have defined mutual interest? Or are we talking about the same thing? Thank you.
So we've got one question about what did you think of the debate last night? So I hope at least one of you was at it. A question about what to do beyond humanitarian crises to long-term endemic structural poverty. What can we do as Canadians? And then the question specifically to Bianca, but perhaps you would reflect as well on South-South cooperation, its future, and how it differs from traditional North-South. Who wants to go first? If you want to go.
Well, thanks for these questions. On the debate last night, unfortunately, I wasn't there. So I hope one of the members of the panel, yes. I came to the reception, but not the debate. I want to address this issue of the formulation of the new development agenda and how to ensure that it addresses the structural issues of poverty. What we see in the formulation of the new agenda is that it is an agenda that will be globally or universally applicable to every country, but flexible enough to be able to address the specific needs of and the specific and different needs of different countries and societies. And this is one of the challenges that we're facing. With the MDGs, it was quite easy. Health, education, all these other things. But we know there are underlying causes of underdevelopment. Issues of human rights, issues of governance, and all these things are issues that need to be addressed if you want to sustain development. And of course, we know in the negotiations now, as we know, the Open Working Group is trying to come up with a number of what they call focus areas. It was 19, now I heard it's about 16, and maybe they're trying to reduce it to about 12. And one of the biggest issues is this whole issue of human rights. The problem with the UN is that it consists of member states. And it's one member, one vote. Whether I come from Gambia, 2 million people, or US, 300 million people is the same. Of course, the influences are different. But I don't want to name countries, but there are a number of member states in the UN who don't want to see a human rights agenda on this. There are a number of African countries who feel that governance is a way of strangling them, so they are actually against the issue of governance. But these are the issues that we have to have in the agenda to address poverty. Poverty is as a result of the denial of rights, whether it is right to water, right to health, right to education, etc. So I hope that at the end of the day, we will end up with something that is useful. Of course, the concern is that we will come up with something that everybody is happy with, but that is useful, not useful to anybody. So it's an agenda that, okay, yes, okay, I can accept it, but at the same time, it doesn't do us any good because it doesn't contain anything substantive. And this is one of the risks we are facing. But hopefully, we should be able to address not only the symptoms of poverty, but then go into the structural causes of poverty. And of course, one of the very big issues also is the issue of inequality. Inequality is not just gender inequality, but inequality of access, political inequality, geographic inequality, and a number of things. This is why we're not talking about inequality, we're talking about inequalities, because there are a number of them. And this is also another critical issue that needs to be addressed. Now, what we can do as Canadians, I think I'll come back to the issue of the voices of the citizens. For us working in development, we see that the way citizens in the developed world are engaged in development is not the same as the way those in the developed world are engaged. In the US, at times when I talk to people about international development, they don't even know what I'm talking about. What they know about is what is happening in the US, what the Congress is discussing, or they talk about our political allies. We need to give money to our political allies. So the engagement of citizens and making sure that you hold your government, maybe I shouldn't be saying that there's somebody sitting there, hold them accountable and responsible, and that their negotiations and whatever they do reflect the voices of the citizens. Because this is really key. I go back to what I said at the beginning. I believe the major partner in development is the citizen himself or herself. Of course, in an organized way through which their voices could be heard. It is one point listening to citizens, it's another point hearing what they say. Because hearing what they say means reflecting their concerns in our negotiations, making sure that our negotiations are guided by what our citizens want and not necessarily what gives us political clout when we come back.
Thanks. Regarding the panel we had yesterday, I was able to be there. It was interesting, many things to learn, but what I missed is a woman's participation in the panel. That was really nice. So this is one area, and I respond to your question that what Canadians can do, and I understand there is many government officials in this room as well as the development partners. The first thing, one thing as a Canadian can do, your company sourced close from my country. So after Natal Tajveen and Rana, many of you was in a dilemma that should we buy or we shouldn't buy? Truly, everyone was, because if something comes in front of me, that would be my first thought even. And to respond to that, I have a very strong position to say that please buy. Because we are not talking about 400 workers or 4,000. We are talking about 4 million workers. If you don't buy, there will be boycott. And boycott would, send a bad condition to these workers who just started learn what is economic freedom is. This will completely destroy their voices, whatever they created, or women empowerment. But when you buy, please be a responsible consumer. Just don't buy, just don't be happy yourself by having these cheap clothes. Also ask to the companies, the best way that I wanted to know more about these workers, which just means more about behind the label, who is making clothes for me. Are they paying well? Are they have voice at workplace? Do they have safe workplace? I think this is your responsibility too. So as a Canadian, you can do that. And many of the government officials who are in this room, they really do have an important role to do. Yesterday I wanted to mention these, or wanted to have this question in the panel, but there wasn't enough time to do that. But one thing that your government give a trade preference to for Bangladesh, which just means we do have tax-free access to your market, which is great, that create jobs. But your trade preference is unconditional. It all talks about money, it talks about dollars, it does not talk about worker rights, it does not talk about human rights within that policy. While the same sort of trade preference which is given by US or European Union, which is conditional. And just to give a sense that US government just suspended their GSP facility, which is one of the trade preference, middle of last year, by giving a 16 notion that if you wanted to regain this GSP trade preference, then you have to improve certain areas, which is safe workplace, union rights, drop the charges against labor organizers. So after that, the government really making changes there. So this is helps. I'm not saying that suspension is a great thing or revoking is a great thing, but when you have conditional trade preferences, then you have leverage to put pressure on the government. When you give the business, at the same time you can put pressure on them. Okay, we wanted to give you business, but you need to do certain improvements. And others, the development agencies who is in here, they can come with their technical support or resource support to my country, because we are talking about that we want jobs with dignity. So the best support that you can do, you can come with, and I think that would be absolutely helpful from Canada. Thank you.
I was also not at the conference yesterday, so apologies. What can Canadians do? And I love to give Paul pictures in Portuguese as to what you should do, and they were giggling in my organization when I was invited here, because we're like, so you were going to go there and tell Canadians what to do. Brilliant. Anyway, I think there are a few things that I wanted to mention. One is around, thinking about South-South cooperation. Although there's great experiences to be shared and there's energy behind a lot of these new actors, there is a capacity and knowledge gap that organizations and the government here can fill up. And a lot of this knowledge revolves around the actual cooperation. So Brazilians know about farming practices or participatory budgeting, but they haven't necessarily worked in Africa for a very long time. So what traditional donors, especially DFID and international multilateral organizations have been supporting a lot is how it's sort of facilitating this engagement and bringing their knowledge to the table. So I think in the future, trilateral cooperation, and not thinking only about government-to-government cooperation, but trilateral cooperation between South-South-North or South-South-South or North-North-South might be an area that we could all work together. The second thing I would ask is, what can Brazilians and other emerging countries do for you? Because some NGOs in Brazil now, for instance, are actually providing cooperation to, for instance, the Netherlands on how to work on participatory budgeting and other democratic policy processes. So I think, and it relates to that mutual interest and sort of real cooperation where you have bi-directionality. You know, we have something to learn, we have something to give, and that gives us a more sort of equal ground to engage in international cooperation. Another thing is around construction of knowledge, and I think we all know that there are issues with our current system, or our current conceptual and theoretical frameworks of development. So it's really a collective effort to think outside the box. And involving and being part of that is very important, but also, and I'm going to quote another participant of this project I was just mentioning, we have to have historical patience. Which means we haven't been thinking about international development as long as you have. And so therefore our processes are, you know, picking up. I agree with a lot of the questioning around, well, but the South-South cooperation providers, they don't want to, you know, join the Paris Declaration or the Busan Declaration, and they don't have their own guidelines. But we need to give time for these things to happen. There are some initiatives, for instance, one initiative that was launched in Mexico last month or 2 months ago, around, it's a network of 7 think tanks to discuss South-South cooperation. And I think this kind of initiatives would really gain from support from organizations and funding partners and governments in Canada. And then lastly, obviously there's a funding situation, right? And I think in Brazil, actually, it's very sad because we have benefited so much from international cooperation, and it has been such, you know, has given so much support for our democratization movement. And what we see now is, you know, a lack of funding for really cutting-edge, incredible organizations that are cutting their work and not being able to sustain it. Because of sort of the crowding out of funding. Around mutual interests, Julia, I think it's difficult to say because there are various interests at play, right? And some of them we might not agree to. So I will give you technical cooperation, you open the way for my companies to come to the Nacala corridor, for instance, in Mozambique, and sometimes drive farmers away. So this is a mutual interest, right? But there are other types of interest that could be in this relationship. I think generally what I find is that at least we're a little bit less hypocritical, because I don't think that the northern donors or northern partners don't have interests. Is that for a lot of times we've been saying that our only interest is solidarity or, you know, global development or poverty reduction, but that's not true. And I think sort of the tough moment that we're living is bringing a little bit more of this reality to us, and we have to figure out what to do with it. Because for us, for instance, for Brazilians, I'm a supporter of international development, but how do I convince my you know, other citizens that we still have national development challenges, but we are, you know, also we also should be working and supporting African or Latin American development. So I think, I'm not sure, I think we still have to understand a lot more of this mutual interest, and actually there's an area that we've been discussing with other southern organizations. We don't even have a coherent view around it. Should we have mutual interest? Should we not have mutual interest? But it's an interesting stand, I think, to establish this sort of more equal partnerships.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one quick thing what our Canadians can do within that. You know, when I mentioned that when a code has been signed between the companies, over 160 companies, so unfortunately we have just one company from Canada, Loblaw Joe Fresh, who signed on, and many of them are denied to sign on, or with maybe other group who really don't have any legal binding agreement. So maybe like Person Bay, Canadian Tire, Nigard, all of them, this company source from my country, but they are not ensuring a safe working place for our workers. So the Canadian definitely can do something in this regards to tell these companies to sign on the accord and ensure our workers have a safe workplace. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Real Laverne. I'm very pleased to stand up here without having to stand behind 20 other people, as is often the case. I don't think this group actually needs questions to keep going. But I do have a question and an observation. As I was sitting listening to your very interesting talks, what I was looking for was what's different about how we're thinking about partnerships now and in emerging years from how we thought about them in the past. I think that's one of the important questions of this conference, and I thought I already sensed an answer coming from you, because I was hearing something coming over and over again, possibly because my own mind is a bit biased in this direction, I'm not sure. But I'm thinking maybe what one could say is that in the past we tended to think of partnerships in terms of complementarity and bringing additional resources to the table. And increasingly what we're learning to value is the value of diversity of ideas and how enriching that is. I remember reading a while back that nobody's ever won a Nobel Prize when they were only in one field. They were all people who crossed over from engineering to economics or something like that. I don't know how true the anecdote is, but it's a good storyline. So I'd like to hear your comments on whether that's where we should be directing our thinking. And if we do, then there's a really, really big question of how you tap diversity in a successful way. Because diversity can also lead to explosion that doesn't yield any results. It can yield failure. And I'll give an example of that. I'm working with a group that supports proportional representation in Canada. We've had 2 referendums, one in Ontario, one in BC. Both failed. And they failed, well, first of all, they succeeded because there was a citizens' assembly put together that proposed really interesting, concrete ideas. And that was diversity. They were ordinary citizens. It failed. Why? It failed because we used a referendum. And people did not bother to learn about the complexity of the issues, and they went with the status quo. So that's interesting. And I think there are a lot of other ways that it can fail. So I'd like to hear some of your comments on how to tap this for strength rather than for failure.
Good morning, my name is Catherine Dingle and I work at Enterprise. So I have a question for anyone on the panel who is willing to answer it. And I'm asking my question as a Canadian. So curious to have your outside perspective on the role of our country, our reputation in these various areas, the UN, in Bangladesh, as trade negotiations and as an aid provider. From Enterprise partners in the South, it's been clear that there's been a distinct shift in how communities, NGOs, the government is seeing Canada as an actor in those countries. And, you know, I think many of us are feeling a little bit glum about maybe the direction, the role that Canada is playing or not playing internationally. But I think it's important for us to hear it from folks that are from the South. And please don't sugarcoat it for us. I think, Kalpona, you've answered a little bit how Canada is perceived, certainly in terms of what's happened after the Rana Plaza, but perhaps Falu or Bianca, you could share a little bit about how Canada is perceived and what your opinion on that is.
Thank you very much. I'm Louise Castleman from the Public Service Alliance of Canada. I want to thank the panelists for this very, very stimulating discussion. I just want to raise a question that I'm not asking you to answer here, but maybe something that can feed into some of the workshops. I'm concerned about the fact that there's kind of an unknown, not unknown, but a silent partner in all this that's not a partner, which is international capital and its decisions about how where it moves its investments, we're looking at Bangladesh, for example, where the garment industry becomes an important source of development for the economy, right? So you pull people out of, who are the young women coming into working in the garment factories? They're from the agricultural rural areas. Is that a good way of development? I'm not questioning the existence of the garment industry. I'm just asking the question, what does this mean? And who has any control over that? So you have young women leaving the rural areas, perhaps because the conditions for farming in the country are so dismal that working hard hours in a garment factory is better than staying in the rural areas, etc. Some of the manufacturers, they would say, this is development. So they're using those words. So I think we need to talk about this, and listening to you concerned about who are the people that sit at the UN, at the level of nation states, and the missing people that are there, the missing global partner, not global partners, they're global capital, they're not there, who are making the decisions about development way beyond whatever little projects we can have. So, you know, when there's a decision about Vietnam growing coffee or Bangladesh growing garments, it has a tremendous impact on development, and we're there to kind of pick up the pieces from the non-governmental sector, et cetera, and the UN and others. So I'm very interested in the South-South partnership as well, but I think to myself, there are trade agreements that even prevent some of the things these farmers are doing. So that was not mentioned. It's illegal in some countries to save seed and to trade seed. So we need to put this on the table, or we're kind of just talking about something we wish could be, and we've already passed that point. So it's just a sound, an alarm, that we need to address this during the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's take these 3 questions. We have time for one last round, so if you're patient for a few minutes, we will do that. Questions on crossover thinking and how to harness diversity for success, not failure, perceptions of Canada globally, and the incentives or disincentives that international capital creates. This time, can we start with you, Bianca?
So, you're asking what's the difference in terms of how we're looking at partnerships now and before. And when I was invited to come here, I remember that when I worked for CARE, we did some work on developing partnership guidelines, and so I went back into that literature review and was giggling because what I found was actually a paper by the North-South Institute in '97 that pretty much put a debate that is very current right now. So I think we know for quite some time what we need to do. It's just really difficult to put that into practice for many reasons. I think what might have changed is that some of these actors involved don't have any more the choice of not getting into partnerships, because power relations have changed. That doesn't mean they have changed for everyone, obviously. Malawi doesn't have a bigger place at the table sometimes. Well, it might have, because you have competing donors, you know, putting money, and therefore they have more room for maneuver. But I think that maybe what this, as Rosalind said, emerging and submerging world has brought us is this kind of urgency to really tackle it in a different way. And I hope that also what is different is around all this discussion on aid and development effectiveness, is that we are getting to a point where we have more consensus, sometimes on a discursive level and not on a practical level, but we have more consensus of where we should be going. You were asking about how to tap into diversity so it doesn't become chaotic, and I was trying to remember this concept of complexity and sort of chaos theory. I don't forget it exactly, but it says how you have to really be at the edge of chaos to be able to foster creativity and innovation. And so to find this edge of chaos is quite complex, and it gives us a big sense of insecurity. But I think that maybe what we're going to be looking for the next, I don't know how many years, is that sort of bordering chaos situation where we could all tap into diversity and think about how we can do things differently, look at different partnerships, different knowledges, really rip ourselves out of the way we think about international development to see if we can come up with better solutions than we have now. To be honest, you know, like I came back to Brazil after 8 years living abroad, and because international development hasn't been such a big sort of force in Brazil it's hard to talk about a public perception of the different sort of northern partners. And I don't hear that a lot, so I'm not going to come up, I could, come up with something, but to be honest, I didn't hear a lot in the sort of public debates what has changed with the changes here in government and what has changed in terms of Canadian funding. The one thing we hear quite a lot in sort of the academic and research level is the importance of IDRC, obviously, and how a lot of organizations still get funding from that that we find quite hard to find nationally. So I wish I could sort of not sugarcoat it, but if I'm going to be honest about the public debate, there's just not much about it.
I just pretty much agree with what Bianca says. I just wanted to touch base one area that Louise has mentioned about the workers who move to, the agriculture field to the factory job, whether, what is the consequences, So just to clear up that, it is not that that every workers who move to the city and getting these factory jobs, they would work in this agriculture field. It is a shortage of jobs there. So many of them do not have any jobs. And some of them who move from agriculture field to a factory job, one other big reason is the environment. They're not just leaving agriculture field jobs. They are forced to move to the city because every year they are being hit up by the floods, cyclone, and their house lands, everything goes to the river, so they don't have anything, so they just move to city and get their jobs. And other kind of people who come to these jobs, they are the domestic workers. There is many domestic workers, they are switching their jobs to the factory job. The reason is they feel these jobs are give them more respect than a domestic worker is, that they feel. Okay, they feel, when they're a domestic worker, most of the time they just get their foods or shelter. They don't get their salary on their hands, so they don't have money. So they feel that when they go to the factory, they will have that empowerment. They would have their money with them. So then they switch their jobs. And my experience lately to interview some of these workers, like I interviewed 10 workers, out of 10, 7 who work as a domestic worker. After working 2 or 3 years in the factory, they came, they're saying that, yeah, they felt that it's a respectable job or it will give them more respect as a domestic worker, but they don't feel it now that it is a respectable job when they are facing enormous problem by the factory management at the workplace. And more concern they raise that when they would work as a domestic worker, they would not have this unsafe workplace that now are there. So that I want to share.
Thank you. I want to come back to this issue of diversity in ideas, which I think is a very critical thing for partnerships. And actually, in the UN, we talked about common but differentiated responsibilities as we move into the new agenda. We agree on a common goal, but we know there are different ways of achieving it, and there are different routes to that. But I want to add that the diversity in ideas doesn't just stop at ideas. There's also now what is emerging in terms of diversity in values. And I think this is something that we need to recognize, particularly between the North and the South. One sensitive issue that many people don't like talking about, but which I will talk about, is this whole issue of LGBT, gay and lesbian rights, and how it is creating a big problem between the North and the South, particularly in Africa, where I always say if a country's parliament goes to the extent of legislating on this, then it's not that easy just to dismiss it. You've got to really look at what are the root causes, why is this happening? And not say, for instance, now I'm dealing with an issue with Nigeria because we are managing what is called the MDG Advocates, funded by Norway, and they're saying that their money is not going to be spent in Nigeria because Nigeria has legislated against gay rights. And now what I keep saying is, I think we've just got to understand and appreciate that we have different values. And we've got to look at how we can negotiate this. It is wrong to impose your values on me, whatever it is. I mean, I don't accept it. So if we have different values, we've just got to look at the diversity, accept the diversity, and see how we can move around it. That's one thing I want to talk about. And how Canada is perceived. Well, I've not been working in an African government the past 8 years, but I know whilst I was there, of course, there's been quite a lot of positive things about Canada, not only IDRC, but also then Canadian CIDA, it was doing quite a lot. And of course, this we had what was called this Gambian Nova Scotia Association, which actually helped to set up the university. So I think there are quite a lot of positive things we're not sugarcoating it. And generally, of course, there's the remark that Canadians are less aggressive than Americans. Similar, but they are less aggressive, and so a little bit much more accepted. Then this issue of who sits on the table making decisions of the UN. Unfortunately, it is government. The UN is a member state entity. And as I said before, if regional governments or local governments or citizens groups, civil society want a table at the UN, it will not happen. It's a member states organization. So therefore, the only way we can make our voices heard at the UN is through our government representatives. We have to ensure that the positioning of our government is influenced by our own thinking and by what we want to do. So I always tell people as we embark on this post-2015 agenda, that you don't have to come to New York to influence the decision. I believe you can have a lot more influence by working with your representatives at the level of the capitals. Because again, a lot of the representatives who are in New York, when it comes to these negotiations, they actually send it back to the capitals, and then based on what they get back from the capitals is when they take a position. So you're here sitting with him, influence him, make sure you influence his position and his thinking, and then that can get your position or whatever you want on the agenda. But if you want a seat on the table, unfortunately, it will not happen. And this is one of the problems, biggest problems we are faced with civil society at the moment. As we start the negotiation, they say, how do we get our voices heard? I say, well, you cannot get a state to sit on the table. The most they can do is allow you informally to come and make a statement. But you see, many a times you're up there making a statement and they are busy, going through their papers. So you are sure that they're not even listening to you. The best way is at the level of the capital, we ensure that what our governments take there incorporates our thinking as citizens.
Thank you. You've been patient, so we can start the last round of questions. Thank you.
Mine's more a comment of appreciation to all the members of the panel for a stimulating conversation. My name is Ellie Annenberg, and I'm with World Vision. But I also wanted to thank you, Kalpona, in particular, because you've opened it up for me to give a plug for our World Vision's No Child for Sale campaign. We started it last month, and the particular campaign is around child labor, and the petition that we're asking Canadians to sign is exactly what you shared with us earlier, around encouraging Canadian companies to sign that accord. So I encourage you all to look at our No Child for Sale website and to sign the petition. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Susie Walsh with CIGI Canada. I very much agree that it's important to do the background work with your own government officials in your own country to try to influence negotiations at the UN. But there are some exciting new models of citizen involvement and citizen voice within the UN system, and particularly at the Food and Agricultural Organization through the Committee on World Food Security. There's a civil society mechanism now that actually gets to sit right at the table, put their flag up and be acknowledged. It's a dynamic, I think, opportunity for real input that other mechanisms are looking to possibly emulate. For example, the International Convention on Biological Diversity. We're talking with them about the idea of setting up a civil society mechanism as well. And you really do get to have a voice. This is unheard of in the past. And so I do think if we're going to talk about new partnerships, there are these opportunities out there. We need to think about things a little differently than I think we have traditionally. It doesn't mean that the civil society organizations vote, but their perspectives get really listened to within the main plenary, etc. So I just wanted to put that out.
Thank you. So that's right. Any last thoughts on these last 2 points, and then we'll wind up. Start with you.
Okay, thank you very much for bringing that, and I definitely agree with you. The formulation of the new agenda, the way it is done, is very much unprecedented. We know with the MDGs, it was 8 men, no women, sitting in a room, coming up with this framework, and then now we spent 5 years going around the world trying to sell the idea to people. So the first 5 years of the MDGs was actually set, particularly with civil society, who thought it was just not making sense. We spent 5 years trying to convince people that this was an agenda that was useful. And it was when civil society actually bought into it and took it up that the MDGs actually took off. Now the formulation of the new agenda is very different. From the onset, it said it had to be transparent, it has to be participatory, and it has to involve everybody. Everybody has an opportunity. You've talked about initiatives, in other places, but particularly for the formulation of the new agenda, there is a UN initiative called My World that we actually are running. And if you have my card, you will see, you can go into the website, where as a citizen you can go in and say, these are the priorities I want to see in the world in the next development agenda. As I said, the Open Working Group, they are now negotiating on the priorities, and at the end of the day, they're going to look at what the world's citizens are saying. And there's one thing I want to challenge Julia and others in Canada to really do quite a lot of mobilization, because I'm sure when you go into the My World, you wouldn't have even 1,000 people that actually have voted on priorities for Canada. Whereas going into a country like Sri Lanka, you have 350,000 people that have expressed their priorities. So this is also another way. And as we know, there's going to be a synthesis report from the SG at the end of this year. Now that synthesis report, we as UN agencies are going to try to gather as much as we can from the various stakeholders we are working with civil society, with parliamentarians, with local authorities, with youth groups, indigenous people's organizations, all kinds of stakeholders. So there again, it is important that your voices are heard, and that this goes into the SG synthesis report, which is going to be the basis for the negotiations next year. So there are quite a number of avenues that civil society can input. I'm not saying that there is none, but what I say is at the end of the day, when it comes to decision making, it is the government officials who make that decision, and our best bet is to influence their positioning from our various bases. Thank you.
Just briefly, I was just thinking again about the question of diversity and how we can tap into new spaces for kind of to inform our thinking. And I don't want to sound too patriotic, but this FAO Council was based on the Brazilian experience of our Food and Nutrition Security Council. But I think the question we need to ask ourselves is: are we really open-minded enough to sit at a table with different perspectives, being of a garment worker, being of a Ecuadorian indigenous leader, Malawian researcher, and not only think they're equal, but to really be open to changing our views and looking at development in a different way. I think that's a big challenge that we all have in sort of going forward.
Thank you all. That I think is a very good spot to end. You reminded us all through your very vital presentations that Canada is a small country, and as such, never mind IDRC, all of that. I go around the world and ask people, do you know where the BlackBerry is made? And of course, most people, even in countries where it is used, don't. That's just a fact. But the point is that Canada is part of a larger community of nations that does matter. And you reminded us that there are many things we can do both as citizens and as governments in this. within that, it struck me also how you pointed out that to achieve development goals, we have to operate at different levels, certainly the grassroots level, but also at the international policy level. And that's important. And last but not least, you reminded us that money, ideas, and values all go together, and that ultimately is what the partnership and the changing global context is all about. So thank you all, and thank you for your questions and discussion as well.